Russian oligarchs are business oligarchs of the former Soviet republics who rapidly accumulated wealth in the 1990s via the Russian privatisation that followed the dissolution of the Soviet Union. The failing Soviet state left the ownership of state assets contested, which allowed for informal deals with former USSR officials as a means to acquire state property. Historian Edward L. Keenan has compared these oligarchs to the system of powerful boyars that emerged in late medieval Muscovy. The first modern Russian oligarchs emerged as business sector entrepreneurs under Mikhail Gorbachev during his period of market liberalization. The term oligarch derives from the ancient Greek oligarchia, meaning the rule of the few. Since 2017, several Russian oligarchs and their companies have been hit by U.S. sanctions under the table of countering America's adversaries through Sanctions Act for their support of the Russian government's malign activity around the globe. In 2022, many Russian oligarchs were targeted and sanctioned by countries around the world as a rebuke of Russia's war against Ukraine. Yeltsin era. During Mikhail Gorbachev's perestroika, many businessmen in Russia imported goods such as personal computers and jeans into the country and sold them for a hefty profit. During the 1990s, once Boris Yeltsin became president of Russia in July 1991, the oligarchs emerged as well-connected entrepreneurs who started from nearly nothing and became rich through participation in the market via connections to the corrupt, but elected, government of Russia during the state's transition to a market-based economy. The so-called voucher privatization program of 1992-1994 enabled a handful of young men to become billionaires, specifically by arbitraging the vast difference between old domestic prices for Russian commodities and the prices prevailing on the world market. Because they stashed billions of dollars in private Swiss bank accounts rather than investing in the Russian economy, they were dubbed kleptocrats. These oligarchs became extremely unpopular with the Russian public, and are commonly thought of as the cause of much of the turmoil that plagued the Russian Federation following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Guardian described the oligarchs as about as popular with your average Russian as a man idly burning bundles of £50s outside an orphanage. Emergence. Economists Sergei Guriev and Andrei Rakinsky contrast older oligarchs with nomenclatura ties and younger generation entrepreneurs such as Kaka Benjikij, who built their wealth from scratch because Gorbachev's reforms affected a period when coexistence of regulated and quasi-market prices created huge opportunities for arbitrage. Although the majority of oligarchs were not formally connected with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, there are allegations that they were promoted by the communist apparatchiks, with strong connections to Soviet power structures and access to the funds of the Communist Party. Mikhail Khodorkovsky started his business importing computers under auspices of the Komsomol Authorized Center for Scientific and Technical Creativity of the Youth in 1986, briefly serving as a deputy secretary of the Komsomol for a district in Moscow in 1987. His move into banking 2 years later was funded with support from Komsomol alumni working in Moscow city government. Later, he served in Russian government as an advisor to the Prime Minister and a Deputy Minister of Fuel and Power while still running his business. Petraevan worked alongside economist Yegor Gaidar in the All-Union Research Institute for Systems Studies, a Soviet Academy of Sciences think tank modeled after RAND. Gaidar later became the economics editor of the Communist Journal, the official theoretical organ of the CC of the CPSU. He also held various positions up to the interim prime minister in the Russian government during 1991-1992. A friend and a business partner of Boris Berezovsky, Yuliy Dubov was a researcher at Vinnytsia as well. Berezovsky himself was head of the Department of System Design at the Another Academy of Sciences Research Center, Institute of Control Sciences. His enterprise logo VAZ was established by the institute as a joint venture. Vladimir Vinogradov was the chief economist of Promstroybank, one of the 6 banks existing in the Soviet Union, previously serving as the secretary of Atom Mash Plant Komsomol organization. Official Russian media usually depicted oligarchs as the enemies of communist forces, which were portrayed as a stereotype that describes political power that wants to restore Soviet-style communism in Russia. Post-Soviet business oligarchs include relatives or close associates of government officials, even government officials themselves, as well as criminal bosses often connected to the Russian government. Some members of these groups achieved vast wealth by acquiring state assets very cheaply during the privatization process controlled by the Yeltsin government of 1991–1999. Specific accusations of corruption are often leveled at Anatoly Chubais and Yegor Gaidar, two of the young reformers chiefly responsible for Russian privatization in the early 1990s. According to David Satter, author of Darkness at Dawn, what drove the process was not the determination to create a system based on universal values but rather the will to introduce a system of private ownership, which, in the absence of law, opened the way for the criminal pursuit of money and power. Involvement in politics. During Yeltsin's presidency, oligarchs became increasingly influential in Russian politics. They helped finance his re-election in 1996. Well-connected oligarchs like Abramovich, Khodorkovsky, Berezovsky, and Potanin acquired key assets at a fraction of the value at the loans for shares scheme auctions conducted in the run-up to the election. Defenders of the out-of-favor oligarchs, often associated with Chubais' party, the Union of Right Forces, argue that the companies they acquired were not highly valued at the time because they still ran on Soviet principles, with non-existent stock control, huge payrolls, no financial reporting and scant regard for profit. They turned the businesses around and made them profitable for shareholders. At the end of the century, the 1998 Russian financial crisis hit some of the oligarchs hard, however, and those whose holdings were still based mainly in banking lost much of their fortunes. The most influential and well-known oligarchs from the Yeltsin era include Boris Berezovsky, Mikhail Fridman, Vladimir Guzinsky, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Vladimir Potanin, Alexander Smolensky, Pyotr Avin, Vladimir Vinogradov, Vitaly Malkin. They formed what became known as the Semi-Bankershina, a small group of businessmen with a great influence on Boris Yeltsin and his political environment. Together they controlled from 50% to 70% of all Russian finances between 1996 and 2000. Fridman, Potanin, Avin, and Malkin retained their wealth in the Putin era, which began in 1999. The Guardian reported in 2008 that oligarchs from the era of former President Boris Yeltsin have been purged by the Kremlin. Putin era. During Putin's first presidency term, a number of oligarchs came under fire for various illegal activities, particularly tax evasion in the businesses they acquired. However, it is widely speculated and believed that the charges were also politically motivated for these tycoons falling out of favor with the Kremlin. Vladimir Guzinsky of Mediamost and Boris Berezovsky both avoided legal proceedings by leaving Russia, and the most prominent, Mikhail Khodorkovsky of Yukos Oil, was arrested in October 2003 and sentenced to 9 years. This was subsequently extended to 14 years, and after Putin pardoned him, he was released on December 20, 2013. An economic study distinguished 21 oligarchic groups as of 2003. Between 2000 and 2004, Putin apparently engaged in a power struggle with some oligarchs, reaching a grand bargain with them. This bargain allowed the oligarchs to maintain their powers, in exchange for their explicit support of and alignment with Putin's government. However, other analysts argue that the oligarchic structure has remained intact under Putin, with Putin devoting much of his time to mediating power disputes between rival oligarchs. Some had been imprisoned, such as Mikhail Miralashvili. Many more have become oligarchs during Putin's time in power, and often due to personal relations with Putin, such as the director of the institute where Putin obtained a degree in 1996, Vladimir Litvinenko, and Putin's childhood friend and judo teacher Arkady Rotenberg. Daniel Treisman proposed using a term oligarch for new Russian oligarchs with backgrounds in Russian military and intelligence. Prominent oligarchs of the Putin era include Roman Abramovich, Alexander Abramov, Oleg Deripaska, Mikhail Prokhorov, Alisher Usmanov, German Khan, Viktor Vekselberg, Leonid Michelson, Vijit Alekperov, Mikhail Friedman, Dmitry Rybolovlev, Vladimir Potanin, Pyotr Avin, and Vitaly Malkin. In 2004, Forbes listed 36 billionaires of Russian citizenship, with a note: this list includes businessmen of Russian citizenship who acquired the major share of their wealth privately, while not holding a governmental position. In 2005, the number of billionaires dropped to 30, mostly because of the Yukos case, with Khodorkovsky dropping from number 1 to number 21. A 2013 report by Credit Suisse found that 35% of the wealth of Russia was owned by the wealthiest 110 individuals. Billionaire, philanthropist, art patron, and former KGB agent Alexander Lebedev has criticized the oligarchs, saying, "I think material wealth for them is a highly emotional and spiritual thing. They spend a lot of money on their own personal consumption." Lebedev has also described them as a bunch of uncultured ignoramuses, saying they don't read books. They don't have time. They don't go to exhibitions. They think the only way to impress anyone is to buy a yacht. He also notes that the oligarchs have no interest in social injustice. On January 30, 2018, the U.S. Treasury published a list of oligarchs per Publ. 11544. Oligarchs in London. A significant number of Russian oligarchs have bought homes in upmarket sections of London in the United Kingdom, which has been dubbed Moscow-on-Thames or London-Grad. Some, such as Eugene Schvidler, Alexander Knaster, Konstantin Kagolovsky, David Wilkowsk and Abram Reznikov, are expatriates, having taken permanent residency in London. Most own homes in both countries as well as property and have acquired controlling interests in major European companies. They commute on a regular basis between London and Russia. In many cases their families reside in London, with their children attending school there. In 2007 Abram Reznikov bought one of Spain's mega recycling companies, Alimac España Trade SL, while Roman Abramovich bought the English football club Chelsea FC in 2003, spending record amounts on players' salaries. The billionaire Moscow oligarch Mikhail Friedman, Russia's second richest man at a time, was restoring Athlone House in London as a primary residence in 2016, to be worth an estimated £130 million when restored. 2008 global recession and credit crisis. According to the financial news agency Bloomberg LP, Russia's wealthiest 25 individuals have collectively lost $230 billion since July 2008. The fall in the oligarchs' wealth relates closely to the meltdown in Russia's stock market, as by 2008 the RTS index had lost 71% of its value due to the capital flight after the Russo-Georgian War of August 2008. Billionaires in Russia and Ukraine have been particularly hard hit by lenders seeking repayment on balloon loans to shore up their own balance sheets. Many oligarchs took out generous loans from Russian banks, bought shares, and then took out more loans from Western banks against the value of these shares. One of the first to get hit by the global downturn was Oleg Deripaska, Russia's richest man at the time, who had a net worth of $28 billion in March 2008. As Deripaska borrowed money from Western banks using shares in his companies as collateral, the collapse in share price forced him to sell holdings to satisfy the margin calls. 2022 invasion of Ukraine and sanctions. After the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, Canada, US, and European leaders with the addition of Japan, took unprecedented steps to sanction Putin and the oligarchs directly. In response to the sanctions, the targeted oligarchs started to hide wealth in an attempt to prevent the Western nations from freezing their assets. These sanctions intend to directly impact the Russian ruling class as a response for their perceived contribution and acquiescence to the war with Ukraine. Although the sanctions tend to miss the richest oligarchs, the impact on the war is unknown due to Putin's power over those that were sanctioned. Since the invasion began, 9 of the Russian oligarchs' yachts have turned their navigation transponders off as they sail to ports where they are less likely to be searched and seized. In addition to freezing foreign holdings, restricting travel, and severing business ties, the sanctions aim to impact the personal lives of a number of oligarchs including Vladimir Putin, Alexander Alexandrovich Vedyakin, Andrei Sergeyevich Putkov, Yuri Alexeyevich Soloviev, Igor Sakhin, Andrei Patrushev, Sergei Sergeyevich Ivanov, Kirill Shamalov, Yuri Slyuzar, Petr Fradkov, Gennady Timchenko. On March 2, 2022, the United States announced a special task force dubbed Task Force Klepto Capture. This team was put together to specifically target oligarchs. It is made up of officials from the FBI, Marshals Service, IRS, Postal Inspection Service, Homeland Security Investigations and Secret Service. The main goal of the task force is to impose the sanctions set against these individuals to freeze and seize the assets that the U.S. government claimed were proceeds of their illegal involvement with the Russian government and the invasion of Ukraine. On March 21, 2022, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project launched Russian Asset Tracker to showcase the profiles and assets of several Russian oligarchs. In popular culture, Peter Morgan's play Patriots depicts the rise and fall of oligarchs by focusing on the story of Boris Berezovsky bringing Vladimir Putin to power and later falling out with him. The play was staged in Almeida Theatre, London in 2022. The 2002 Russian movie Tycoon tells the story of emergence of oligarchs during the early years of Russian capitalism. The film is based on The Big Ration, a book about Boris Berezovsky written by Yuliy Dubov. The main antagonist of the 4th episode of the first season of Fast and Furious, Spy Racers is a Russian oligarch named Siderikov, who is known to be a notorious high-end arms dealer. One of the most recurring characters during the 3rd and 4th seasons of Billions is the ruthless European billionaire oil tycoon Grigor Endolov, a powerful Russian oligarch, owner of a billionaire oil empire and a dangerous criminal from Eastern Europe with ties to the European criminal underworld and protected by various authoritarian governments.